Everyone knows that you have to eat a good diet and exercise regularly to give you the greatest likelihood of living longer. But which one of them is more important? I know a lot of people have their own opinions about this topic. They think that diet is all that matters and you don't have to exercise at all, or that the diet is secondary to exercise. In this video, I'm going to look at the available data on the effects of exercise and diet on longevity in humans to see which one matters more. I'm not going to rely on philosophical beliefs about diet or exercise, but I am going to look at which one is more effective in reducing the risk of all-cause mortality and the risk of heart disease mortality, which is the #1 killer. Intuitively, you can predict that, both matter, but you would be surprised to see which one matters more. Let's start with diet because there's a lot more uncertainty about the effects of diet on longevity. The problem with diet is that what constitutes a good healthy diet? When you look at social media, you'll hear conflicting opinions all the time. One day of the week it's eggs are bad for you, and the next day they're good for you. That's why in this video I'm not going to look at the specific foods. Instead, I'm going to take the position that a generally whole foods diet is what's considered a healthy diet, and you want to minimize the intake of ultra-processed foods. This is what you also see in the studies. In this 2023 study from the UK, they found that shifting towards a healthier diet increased life expectancy by over 10 years. The largest gains in life expectancy were observed from consuming whole grains, nuts and fruits, and fewer sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats. If you look at the difference in all-cause mortality risk between the lowest quintiles of consumption and the highest, then they're at most varying by about plus and minus 20% at most. The highest quintile of legume consumption resulted in a 28% lower risk of all-cause mortality, and it was only 18% for whole grains. Only with some of the most unhealthy foods like sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meat, you see a 59% and 47% higher all-cause mortality risk. Even a high adherence to a Mediterranean diet, which I think we can all agree on is generally very healthy, has been seen to result in only a 23% lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to low adherence. Now, epidemiological studies aren't very good studies. But even here, when you look at the risk reductions, then the 20% risk reduction isn't that big, especially given the fact that epidemiological studies are confounded by many other variables. 20% for observational studies is minuscule, which is why you also see a lot of conflicting results from different observational studies. With epidemiological studies, you can only be certain of them if the effect sizes are massive and they're consistent. For example, to this date, we don't have any randomized controlled trials proving that smoking causes cancer or heart disease. We only have epidemiological observational studies showing increased risk from smoking. The reason we're so certain that smoking absolutely increases the risk of heart disease and cancer is because the increased risk in observational studies is massive. In observational studies, the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality among current smokers is anywhere between 100 to 400% higher compared to never smokers. When it comes to lung cancer, then the risk of lung cancer is 17,000% higher among heavy smokers who've smoked for decades compared to never smokers. Again, there are no randomized controlled trials looking at the effects of smoking on heart disease or cancer, because it would be unethical to do this kind of a study. And the increased risk from smoking is so massive and so consistent, everyone pretty much accepts it as fact that smoking increases the risk of heart disease and cancer and even causes it. We don't have any of that with nutritional epidemiological studies, and the studies we have find a meager 20 to 40% difference in mortality, which is very small for observational studies. Fortunately, we don't have to rely on observational studies, we also have randomized controlled trials. This 2024 meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, which is considered the highest quality of evidence, showed that adopting a Mediterranean diet resulted in a 48% lower risk of major adverse cardiovascular events compared to a control diet. The Mediterranean diet also had a 46% lower risk of cardiovascular disease death. The Mediterranean diet also had 38 and 37% lower risk of myocardial infarction and stroke, respectively. These are much bigger numbers than in the observational studies we talked about. And this is a meta-analysis of 4 randomized controlled trials, which is considered to be stronger evidence than observational studies to begin with. So you could say that eating a Mediterranean-style diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, olive oil and seafood results in lower rates of cardiovascular disease and death. Now the caveat here is that it was compared to a control diet, which is the standard way of eating. Of course, a Mediterranean diet is going to outperform the standard American diet, because that diet is higher in ultra-processed foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, and it's low in fruits and vegetables. However, if we do want to see the absolute effect of diet as a whole on the risk of heart disease and mortality, then we do have to compare it to an unhealthy diet. The same way we would have to compare no exercise to exercise to see the effects of exercise on mortality risk. What I'm looking at in this video, how much can you reduce your mortality risk with diet or exercise? We don't have any studies comparing the effects of Mediterranean diets to paleo diets or keto diets, but we do have the observational studies showing that a higher adherence to a Mediterranean diet, a score of 6 or higher, results in a lower risk of all-cause mortality than a score of 4 to 5 or 0 to 3, which indicates lower adherence. So it looks like that a generally healthier eating pattern that includes more whole foods and less ultra-processed foods does reduce your mortality risk more than a diet that is heavier in ultra-processed foods and lower in whole foods. Higher adherence to a healthier eating pattern results in lower risk than a lower adherence. I want to highlight again that the risk reductions of about 20 to 40% isn't that big, especially for observational studies. In the randomized controlled trials, the Mediterranean diet did lower the risk of cardiovascular events by 48% and cardiovascular death by 46%, which is more significant, but it's still not as high as higher levels of physical activity. So this is the segue to exercise. With exercise, you can find quite massive differences in mortality. For example, in this study, people with the highest cardiorespiratory fitness or VO2 max had up to 4 times lower risk of all-cause mortality compared to those with the lowest cardiorespiratory fitness. That's a 300% difference, which is almost equal to smoking and multiple times greater than with diet. The caveat is that the least fit individuals are the ones with extremely poor cardiovascular fitness, but at the same time, the most fit individuals in this study weren't professional athletes either, as their VO2 max was only 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute, or 14.3 METs. What's more, the mortality risk between the most fit and the second fittest people was still 39%. So even among the extremely fit and very fit, you see an equal risk percentage as with the healthy diet pattern and unhealthy diet pattern, which as you remember was between 20 to 48%. The mortality risk between moderately fit, which would characterize the average person who doesn't really exercise, and the most fit, which characterizes people who do exercise, but they're by no means athletes, then it's 113%, which is massive, and double the amount of diet. You would imagine that the people with higher fitness also had other healthy lifestyle habits. I'm sure there's an element of truth in that, but the authors of the study did control for these confounding variables, such as age, BMI, sex, history of cardiovascular disease, and other risk factors like smoking, hypertension, and diabetes. This means that these results weren't because of a healthy user bias. So based on this study, the fitter you were, the lower your risk of mortality, and the difference was well over 100% when comparing fit people to moderately fit people. That's several times greater than what we saw with diet. And the only way you would have been in the fit category was if you were exercising more, because they controlled for other variables such as obesity, diabetes, etc. But what if you exercised and ate a healthy diet at the same time? Would you get compounding benefits? This 2023 study looked at exactly that. They found that high physical activity with either a healthy or unhealthy diet was associated with a 57% lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease and 47% lower risk of all-cause mortality. Diet had no effect on mortality risk or heart disease, whereas the only thing that mattered was exercise. Check out this graph that illustrates this quite nicely. It shows the risk of all-cause mortality over 200 months or 16 years. The higher the line, the lower the risk of mortality. You basically want to be as close to the ceiling as possible. The green and orange line illustrates people who exercised. Green line means unhealthy active, which means they were exercising and ate an unhealthy diet. The orange line means healthy active, which means they exercised and ate a healthy diet. As you can see, those two lines are almost identical. No difference in mortality risk between a healthy or an unhealthy diet, as long as the people exercised. The blue and red lines refer to people who didn't exercise, and they ate either a healthy or unhealthy diet. As you can see, there's almost no difference in them either. They found similar results with cardiovascular disease mortality. People who exercised had a lower risk of heart disease mortality regardless of the diet, whereas the people who didn't exercise had a higher risk regardless of the diet. Now, this is kind of a surprising result. You would predict that a healthy diet plus exercise results in better outcomes, but diet had literally no effect on mortality and heart disease. The only thing that mattered was whether you exercised, whether that be with a healthy or unhealthy diet. You would think again that these results were because people who didn't exercise had higher body weight, they had unhealthier habits, etc. But the study did control for these factors again, like age, smoking, alcohol intake, being overweight or obese, education, and even socioeconomic status. And keep in mind that exercise reduced mortality risk even with an unhealthy diet, which indicates that it was the presence of exercise that mattered the most. There are also different types of exercise. Walking isn't necessarily exercise, but it's physical activity that does affect your mortality risk and longevity. In this 2022 meta-analysis of 15 cohort studies, walking was linearly associated with a reduction in all-cause mortality. In over 60-year-olds, walking 16,000 steps per day compared to 3,000 was associated with a 60% lower risk of all-cause mortality. In younger than 60-year-olds, the lowest risk was seen at 8,000 steps. That's again much higher risk reduction than in the nutritional studies. So in observational studies, exercise outperforms diet all the time, and the risk reduction is much greater in the exercise studies than in the diet studies. But what about the randomized controlled trials, because they're much higher quality evidence? This 2021 review of randomized controlled trials looked at the effects of exercise on mortality, heart disease, fractures, and diabetes. From this forest plot you can see the dots for each individual study, either favoring exercise or not. Most of the studies suggest that exercise generally favors cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, but is not always consistent, and it's not a massive effect. When it comes to diabetes and fractures, then the effect of exercise is much more consistent and much more favorable. Exercise appears to reduce the risk of diabetes and the incidence of fractures a lot more, which might be because it's much easier to study diabetes and fractures than all-cause mortality, because it takes decades for people to die. So overall, exercise does appear to have a positive effect on health outcomes and mortality in randomized controlled trials. Whether or not it's better than the diet randomized controlled trials is hard to say, because to see those outcomes you would need decades, and it's very hard to do randomized controlled trials that last for decades. Alright, so let me bring it all together and give you some takeaways. In observational studies, exercise outperforms diet in terms of the magnitude of effect and consistency. The risk reduction in mortality is very small in nutritional epidemiological studies, whereas they tend to be much higher in exercise epidemiology. You can find any study either favoring or not favoring a particular food group, but with exercise, there appears to be more consistency in terms of the risk of all-cause mortality and heart disease. In randomized controlled trials, you do find that healthier eating patterns that are more whole foods based rather than ultra-processed provide greater health benefits and a lower risk of mortality and heart disease. For exercise, randomized controlled trials provide a slightly smaller effect for mortality risk, but a pretty big risk reduction in diabetes and fractures, which are one of the leading causes of death in older people. So the answer is obviously that both matter. Diet matters and exercise matters. They matter in different ways and in different degrees. I don't think there's evidence to conclusively say that one matters more or the other, because it's almost impossible to conduct that kind of a study. However, what we can be certain of is that eating a predominantly whole foods diet is better than a predominantly ultra-processed diet. Does it have to be 100% whole foods and 100% perfect? Well, what does that mean? A perfect diet is very different for different people. It doesn't appear that you need to be 100% perfect with your diet, but I would suggest that at least 80 to 90% of your diet should be whole foods based. The same with exercise. Do you have to be an athlete to get those benefits? No. Based on even the studies on daily step counts, then just going from 3,000 to 8,000 steps provides a 60% risk reduction in mortality. And when you look at the risk reduction from VO2 max, then a VO2 max of 50 is already providing you a massive risk reduction. Whereas we don't have any data about the risk reduction from athletes, who typically would have a VO2 max in the 60s and 70s. So, with both diet and exercise, doing something better than being completely sedentary and overweight will provide the greatest benefits, and after a certain point, you hit a plateau of benefits and possibly even diminishing returns. So rather than being 100% perfect with your diet and exercise, you need to get over the first hump of benefits and then optimize it to about 80%. What matters here also is your blood markers. Your blood markers are affected by many other things, not only your diet and exercise. Your blood work is more like the amalgamation of all your lifestyle factors, your sleep, your supplements, your relationships, your stress, your diet, your exercise, your genetics. At the end of the day, your blood markers are what actually reflect your inner health. Yes, diet and exercise affect your blood markers, but people react differently to different diets and different exercise routines. So the blood work is more the amalgamation of all the things that happen in your life. That's why I always emphasize the importance of measuring your blood work. It doesn't matter if you have the perfect diet or exercise routine, if your blood markers are off, then it's not really the best situation. Now, of course, a healthy diet and a healthy exercise routine typically results in better blood markers, but your North Star should be the blood markers, not the diet or not the exercise. Check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, that walks you through 24 chapters on all different aspects of aging and longevity. You'll learn about nutrition, exercise, blood work, and supplements. Get The Longevity Leap from Amazon. You can also get 2 bonus chapters about skin aging and my own personal routines. Send me proof of your purchase to Siim@siimlund.com and I'll send you the bonus chapters. Other than that, thanks for watching this video. Make sure to click the like and subscribe for future videos about living longer and staying healthier. My name is Siim. Stay optimized, stay empowered.